Welcome to my 15-year review of my Grand Seiko SBGA015. And yes, that's right, I've had this watch for more than 15 years now, so it's high time I did a review of this watch. Before I begin, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please be sure to hit subscribe and hit that like button while you're at it. Okay, so let's get into the review of what may be, I think, the most significant Grand Seiko of modern times. Well, really of the last 20 years. And that really is the spring drive model. The spring drive models of Grand Seiko are just watches that use a completely different technology to regulate the time. Unlike automatic watches, a spring drive uses a quartz crystal to essentially break the mainspring to get the time to go with whatever is the oscillation of the quartz crystal. Which is why the seconds hand on a spring drive has that completely smooth sweep. Unlike, say, the sweep of, say, automatic, where you can clearly see that an automatic watch has a slight stagger as it goes around the dial. Anyway, let's focus back on this particular watch. So this watch was introduced in 2006. This is the SBGA015. As I said, it has a textured dial, about 40 millimeters, 39.9 millimeters, 47 lug to lug roughly. And what is significant about this watch is, when I got this in Japan, you could not get Grand Seiko watches in the US, or really in Europe for that matter. Grand Seiko was really a Japanese only brand in the 1990s and early 2000s. And yes, there were dealers, but these watches were very rare. I remember people would look at my watch and say, hey, that's a nice watch. And then they would see the Seiko name and say, oh, is that a Seiko? Because they wouldn't really read that small text down below that said Grand Seiko. And in those days, there was this bias that Americans and Europeans had, which was that to get a good watch, it had to be a Swiss watch. And it was great for people like me because in the 2000s, these Grand Seikos were better than any watch that the Swiss could ever produce. The finishing on this was just staggering. Everything in this was just all about excellence. And the really nice thing was it was very stealth. Whereas if you had a Rolex or an Omega or a watch like that, people would know what those watches were and they knew those watches cost money. People would look at a Grand Seiko and it would just slip under the radar because nobody expected a Seiko to have, at least people who did know, they didn't realize that Seikos would have better quality than any of the Swiss compatriots. So with reference to this particular watch, this has a textured dial. It has these vertical brushing. It's kind of hard to see. It's very subtle. And I think that's really one of the key points of what used to be Grand Seiko watches is they were extremely subtle watches. Nowadays, whenever you think of the SBGA series, which is the spring drive, you think of, I think, the 011, the snowflake spring drive. But most of the people who sing praises for the snowflake were probably wearing fossil watches when this watch came out in 2006. Don't get me wrong, it's not that I don't like the snowflake and the textured dials. I think Grand Seiko in the 2021, well, really since 2011 when it became an independent brand and they got rid of the Seiko logo, it just became a lot more showy and a lot more fashion driven. These used to be very classy but extremely low profile watches, and that's just not the case anymore, and that's okay. Seiko makes more money, so I'm not going to complain. So obviously this is a beautiful dial. All Grand Seikos have these amazing dials. There's like a very slight hint of blue in certain angles, which I think also comes from the anti-reflective coating that's on this domed crystal. Obviously, the shallow dome is just exquisite. You can see it, but barely. Obviously, it has fabulous anti-reflective coating. Please understand, everything with a Grand Seiko is always in the superlatives. There is that zaratsu polishing that everybody again goes nuts about on the rehot. In fact, you can see all the details in just a different perspective when it's mirrored in the rehot. The hands, they obviously have a level of fit and finish that's just really no watch manufacturer has hands the way Grand Seiko has. They have a sharpness that's just like absolutely staggering. There is like really nothing that matches the level of polish. So you can see it's beveled, and there are really three planes along with a paint inlay in the middle, which is the black enamel. That same thing goes to the hour markers, which are sculpted, curved hour markers. And again, they have these multifaceted surfaces with the enamel inlay. It's hard to realize, but there's actually a black enamel inlay. Let me see if I can get the light to catch it. That mark the hands as well as the hour markers. There is the power reserve dial on the at 8 o'clock with its classic arc scale. It's really hard to show it, but there are actually these concentric circles with these radiating lines that run across that the power reserve marker. And that used to be a signature of spring drive watches from the early 2000s, and it's just absolutely, I would not buy a spring drive that does not have that power reserve indicator at 8 o'clock. The sapphire crystal actually has a dual curve, which just gives it that very distinctive look. It's really one of the best crystals that I have. The crown obviously is a signed crown, and it has crown guards because they got rid of crown guards later on, but since this was a watch that was a daily beater, the crown guards are actually something I do appreciate. It does keep the crown protected from, say, slamming it into a door frame or something like that. The zaratsu polishing on the case has not really fared that well, but that's okay. This watch is 15 years old. There's really nothing that you can expect on a watch to, you don't obviously expect that, say, the rehot zaratsu polishing, so that's really what it was like when I got it originally. Let's get rid of fingerprints. This is a fingerprint magnet. It is amazing. If I put a fingerprint on the crystal, you can clearly see that fingerprint reflect on the highly polished dials. And that can be a bit disconcerting at times, that often you realize there's a fingerprint on the crystal, and when you're reading your dials, you will keep seeing that there's a smudge or these lines on the dials. It's just because they're so reflective. The date window is beautifully framed. Well, everything really about this watch is really beautiful. It has a highly polished metal bezel around it that is chamfered, and obviously the numbers are perfectly printed. This watch is all about perfection. You buy a Grand Seiko because you really want the best that Seiko could produce. And the same goes obviously with the dial, with the bracelet. It is a stunning bracelet if there ever was one. Obviously this has been used, but the brushing still looks new. Whenever you put this watch next to other watches, you instantly realize that this watch is something completely different. This watch reeks of quality. The crown is obviously signed because, and remember, this is from 2006. Grand Seiko did not do display back cases in those days because these were really like a Seiko diver. And this is why I nowadays have my Seiko divers. Is these were ultimately watches for utility. These were not watches that you bought, used 5 times, then put it, then tried to sell it off at a profit, maybe a year or two later. That's not what Seiko Grand Seiko was about. This was a watch for somebody who appreciated the finer things in life, but was also able to use it and not just save it. So I tell everybody who gets watches, like that's my standard advice. Wear your watch. Don't save the watch just because you're worried you'll get a scratch or something. It just doesn't matter. Life is short. You have to enjoy the watch. Let me get rid of my fingerprints. Let's keep going actually, because this is a fingerprint magnet. It's really impossible to save it from fingerprints. This watch was not used for a few years, so my movement started working a little slow, but I've just put it on a winder and now the watch is keeping perfect time. In conclusion, would I buy a Grand Seiko again? Probably. I mean, I do like Grand Seiko watches, but it does bother me how Grand Seiko has moved on from its days of being a very extremely classy but fairly low profile watch to, probably an extremely popular watch these days, but going more into the days of exhibition casebacks and fancy textured dials like lakes and birch trees and snowflakes and what have you. For me, I would take a Grand Seiko that's subtle, understated, but extremely sophisticated. Really the best thing that money can buy. 15 years later, I have no complaints with this watch. I have used this watch. You can see lots of dings on the dial. You can see some scratches, like there's obviously hairline scratches everywhere, nothing major. The crystal's absolutely fine. The crystal looks like it's new. The watch dial, really, I mean, for the money that was spent on this watch and the value that I got, I don't think I have few watches that provide value per dollar like this watch does. There's a scratch. I love seeing that scratch. You can't really feel it, but that goes to show just how fancy the brushing on this watch is. That it's a very hard metal, but yes, the brushed surface does scratch. And the brushing is a beautiful satin brushing. It's not an ordinary brushing under any circumstances. The watch just has a radiance to it that it can only be appreciated if you see it in person. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that 15-year look at my Grand Seiko. Please be sure to let me know of any comments that you may have in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to my channel and let me know which watch I should review next.